the flagship program in this state, right? And
a bullshit, a bullshit, a bullshit, a bullshit.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another edition of the Raw Prospect Podcast, deep in the heart of Longhorn sports, ladies and gentlemen. Wednesday, August 21st, 10:05 p.m. local time, here in a hot and humid Houston, Texas. We are officially Vince Young days from kickoff. You know what that means. 10 days away, as of today, from Texas kicking off their 2024 season, and we are a mere less than 72 hours away from the college football season getting going. We've got a loaded show for you tonight, so don't have much time to waste. My name is Michael Ween. Joining me tonight is Mr. Amy Nixon. Before we get to him and before we jump into our content for today, which I'm sure you guys will find very interesting and fun, so we're going to do a little exercise here in a minute. Please like and subscribe to our channel. Likes help the algorithm, and we greatly appreciate if you subscribe and tell your friends about us. Amy Nixon, what's up?
What is up is we're 72 hours away from football. And honestly, like we're here, man. Like, there's games this weekend. Like, that's all you really got to tell me. And like, I'm just so ready for it.
Yeah, and next week will be game week. So as we've told you before we hop into our first segment, Emmy and I are planning on, as we enter the football season full swing, we're planning on sticking to a Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday podcast schedule. And we've kind of outlined before how that's going to go during the football season. On Sundays, we'll be recapping the games, college football that weekend. Tuesdays, we'll be recapping the NFL games for that weekend, as that'll allow us to get past the Monday Night Football games. And then Thursdays will be a combination of Dithole and or NFL and or playoff baseball shows.
Or Thursday night football live streams too.
Right. It'll just vary based upon the time and place that we're in. You know, if we're in the World Series, it might be a baseball show. If it's right before the playoffs, we might be previewing the playoffs. But otherwise, it'll be mostly football until basketball season starts. So you guys have a lot of great content to look forward to, especially here in the next week. As on next Thursday's Dithole, we're going to be previewing some games. Biggest amongst are Notre Dame A&M, Georgia Clemson. We'll, of course, talk about Texas Colorado State, and then there will be a couple others mixed in there. And we'll talk about how we'll do that and what that will look like. But in terms of deep in the heart of Longhorn sports, I can tell you right now to expect an NFL episode tomorrow night, at least from what we've discussed. Another Dithole on Sunday night, and then NFL Tuesday night, and then Dithole next Thursday night before week one of college football kicks off. Does that sound like a good schedule to you?
Yeah.
Before we hop into it?
Good.
Okay. So, as you guys know, if you've been consistently tuning in, and we've gotten some pretty consistent viewership on these shows over the past month or two, Emmy and I, along with going along our individual team previews in college football, we've been episode by episode talking about the personnel position by position on this Texas football team. And in our last episode of Dithole, we officially finished all the positions on the Texas defense. And so I was thinking this week, why not Emmy and I get together as a collective football mind, say I'm Sark and he's PK, or vice versa. It really doesn't matter. But we get together like we're in a meeting, like they're going to have here over the next week in preparation for the first game. And why not we try to project the two deep on the Texas defense as we see it, based on what we're hearing, based on what we've heard from all the reporting and how we view these players. Why don't we go ahead and project the 2 deep of the Texas defense, their base defense, which is a 4-2-5, and have a little discussion here on the show. We'll just run through the exercise and we'll see how long it takes. So
Yep.
I'm going to bring up, and then on Sunday, once we've finished going through the receivers and tight ends, we'll do the same thing on the offense. But I thought the defense will be a fun discussion. So I don't know how much bigger I'm going to be able to make this. I'll try while we're working on it to make it bigger. But basically what you see here is we're going to do a 2 deep depth chart projection for each position for the first team and second team. This projection up top will be who we project to run out on the field the first play against Colorado State. This projection down here is going to be what we see going on at the end of the season, say after the regular season is over, and if what we see, fit for this Texas team going into the playoff or postseason, things of that nature. Okay. But we're going to start, of course, up top with the next week, what we project for next week. So I'm Sark, you're PK. Let's go ahead and jump to the positions that we know. So PK, I think we would agree that we project Anthony Hill to be the best player on our defense, and he's going to start at Mike linebacker. We're going to move him around, do a lot of different things with him, but he's going to start at our Mike linebacker position. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, Steve, I agree. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And then next to him, I think we got to go David Benda, don't you? He's got the most experience.
Solid in run defense.
Right. Yeah, very smart football player. Doesn't have the physical gifts that maybe some other linebackers do, but definitely a serviceable plus player like he showed at the end of last year. So he's going to be our weak side linebacker. Okay. And then on the defensive line, I think for Colorado State, what we know is we're going to run out Alfred Collins at our 3 technique defensive tackle, and we're going to run out Vernon Broughton. And this is one of the positions that could change by season's end. But based on his experience in our base defense, we're going to run out Vernon Broughton next to Alfred Collins on our interior of our defensive line. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I think going into camp, we weren't like the highest on the prospects of Vernon Broughton starting for this team, but he's shown a lot of good things in camp. So you got to go based on that. He's been in the program for years, and if he can take a step forward, that'll be big for this team.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I format this, we're going to finish off our front 7 here. So here's another guy who's been in the program for a long time. He's coming back as a 5th-year senior. He led the Big 12 in pressures last year as our strong side defensive end, or what in the Texas defense we call our jack position. Barron Sorrell. Do you agree that week 1, based on his experience, his strength, his ability to play the run, his ability to generate pressure, that Barron Sorrell will start at the strong side edge position?
Absolutely. I think he's going to be playing on Sundays come fall of 2025. I think you can just about lock that in with the skill set that he's developed.
I would agree. It's just a matter of where does he end up falling in the NFL draft next year, provided that he stays healthy. And by the way, guys, all these projections are based, of course, on the fact that Texas gets a good bill of health throughout the season, meaning
Right.
Most of these guys stay healthy. Now, at our weak side edge, last year it was, Ethan Burke played some there. we had some other guys rotate in at that position. But based on what we've seen in camp and based on what our assistant coaches have seen, I think we got to put Trey Moore out there. We went out and we got him in the portal. We need some athleticism off the edge. We need to go get the quarterback, and Trey Moore looks like the guy suited to do that. And I think we should throw him out there first play, see what he's got. What do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation because it's definitely a different skill set. I see Trey Moore as kind of more of a BGO speed off the edge kind of guy, kind of that skinnier pass rusher. I don't want to throw the name Von Miller out there because he's one of the best of all time, but kind of that skinny build of like a Tyree Wilson, that kind of guy. And Ethan Burke is, I think, a little bit more stocky and has the body type to be able to defend the run better in theory. But I just think the potential that Trey Moore gives you as a pass rusher is just that much higher where you got to give him the edge. No pun intended.
So we'll go with Trey Moore. And there's going to be lots of rotation at that position, but for the first play, we'll throw Trey Moore out there for some pass rush, what's the word I'm looking for? Just for the pass rush, right? The pass rush ability that he provides.
Yeah.
Okay.
Third downs.
Now, what everyone's really kind of talking about. It's been the story of Texas camp of how good the secondary has looked in the two scrimmages. And so I think we know, as of right now, I think for the first play against Colorado State, based on everything we've seen in practice, everything that we've heard, we know that we're going to throw out Derek Williams at one safety position and likely Michael Taft at another safety position. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and I think the transfer that we brought in from Clemson, he's still going to play a role on this team, and
Absolutely.
We're not saying he's not going to be involved, but I think those are our two guys starting. And I think with Derek Williams, him being a 5-star guy, him being a guy that we see as a potential star at the safety position, it just feels like a guy that you want in there, getting experience, getting reps early on in the season. And if you need to go to that experience later on, we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So, in my opinion, only one of the three remaining positions is really up for grabs, and it's the field corner. Because I think we know Malik Muhammad has boundary corner on lockdown. Do you agree with that?
Yep.
Okay. And
literal lockdown.
Yes. And based on what he's shown in camp, emerging as a leader and being a guy that's been thrown out by myself, Steve Sarkisian, a lot in these press conferences, is trying to highlight the plays that he's making in camp. Jalen Gilbo is going to be our starter at the nickel or star position in our defense. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. From what I've heard, he's the best tackler out of the bunch. And he's brought a physicality to the spot that hasn't been there from the other options there. So I think from a coverage standpoint, I think we have really good options. But I think as an overall player, Jalen Gilbo just has the edge in terms of physicality. And you wouldn't think that based on his build either.
Right. Okay, so this is where we're going to start working our way down into the second team, or players that are on the two deep and are going to get playing time but aren't going to be thrown out there first play against Colorado State. In my opinion, based on the circumstances and what I've heard lately and what I've seen in practice, we're going to give Jahdae Barron, a guy who's been in the program a guy who came back to try to elevate his draft stock, and a guy who we've put at outside corner, has looked good at outside corner, making plays, forcing fumbles. To see what he can do at outside corner against Colorado State, I think we throw Jahdae Barron, who's experienced, who knows our defense, out there, even though Gavin Holmes isn't too far behind.
Right.
We will rotate in Gavin Holmes. In fact, I think Gavin Holmes had an interception in our last scrimmage. And he's been making plays all over the place. But I think we throw Jahdae Barron out for his opportunity at field corner opposite Malik Muhammad. What do you say?
Yeah, and I think moving him to the outside, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, it hides his weaknesses a little bit. When he's in the slot and he's facing those small, quick receivers with those two-way goes, he's not able to anticipate and use his experience and smarts as the position as much. And I think on the outside, you're facing those bigger, more physical wide receivers. I think Barron is more suited for that.
Yeah, I would agree. So that finishes off our starting defense. To start off our players on the two deep, I think, as we mentioned, Malik Muhammad's got that boundary corner on lockdown, barring some kind of injury, which we absolutely don't hope for. But Gavin Holmes is going to be the guy consistently rotating in, I think, at least to start the season, with Jahdae Barron at field corner. The wild card in this situation, which we can potentially talk about once we get to, our end of season projections, is how does Javion Cole, the transfer from San Jose State, factor into this rotational equation at the field corner position. But I think, at least to start the season, Gavin Holmes is that guy on the 2D. What do you say?
Yeah, I agree. The speed and frankly, just how he's played in camp, it just puts him in that spot pretty easily.
Okay. And then I think we know that Andrew Makuba is going to be getting lots of work to start the season as our third safety, technically. And the guy he's mostly going to rotate in with is going to be, if we want our 5 best players on the field, and this is no shot whatsoever at what Michael Taaffe has become. But I think we're probably taking Michael Taaffe off the field rather than Derek Williams. What do you say?
Yeah, I agree. Taaffe is someone who I also think is going to get a look in the NFL, but he was a walk-on and had to kind of work for his spot, and he's a freaking heat-seeking missile on defense. But at the end of the day, you want that higher-end athleticism on the field, and that's what Derek Williams gives you.
Yeah. Behind Malik Muhammad at boundary corner, this is a curious one. Right now, it would seem, even though we haven't heard a lot of noise from this particular person, in practice, it would seem that Kobe Black is that guy. He's a 5-star freshman. I think he's suited with his size and physicality to play kind of the role that Manny Muhammad played last year, and he'll work in, he'll get reps there. Maybe Javion Cole moves over there at some point. I don't know, but I think to start the season, it's one of these younger corners. I think Kobe Black is that guy. I mean, there's a reason you go out and get these guys in recruiting. What do you think?
Well, so here's the thing. So I think, in my opinion, the backup boundary corner is actually also Gavin Holmes. But if we were to actually project, if say Malik Muhammad got hurt, I think you move up, get Gavin Holmes into that spot. But for the sake of this exercise, I think you're right. I think it is Kobe Black. And it's like you said, it's an interesting conversation because there's some things that you can shuffle around. Like maybe you can, you know, maybe you can experiment with a little bit of Jade Barron in that spot, kind of shuffle around a few things in practice the week before. And of course, that's if Malik Muhammad gets hurt. But yeah, I think
I'll tell you what
it is
do.
Kobe Black. I think it.
It could vary based on our matchup, right? So there's a thing that teams do in depth charts where they'll put an or at certain positions. You'll see it on the Texas depth chart once it's released on Monday. I'm sure they'll have ors at certain positions on the depth chart. So I'm going to put Gavin Holmes, because I think you make a good point, or Kobe Black. How does that sound to you?
Yeah. I think that's more realistic.
Okay. Okay, so let's work a little faster here. So I think similar to what you said about Gavin Holmes, I think since they have some depth at corner, I think if anything were to happen to Jalen Gilbo, they just move Jade Barron back to nickel because he knows that position better than anyone else. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's definitely our best option.
The
What is
other
it?
option,
His 5th year?
yeah, the only other option I could think of that we could put an or proposition here is,
I think it's the kid with 3 names. I can't remember.
No,
Is that who you're thinking of too?
no, I'm thinking of, gosh, I don't know why I'm blanking on his name. The only other option, in my opinion, would be Jelani McDonald, who's worked some at safety and he's worked some, he's in the same recruiting class as Jalen Gilbo, was a borderline 5-star. He's worked some at safety, and he's also worked some at nickel. I think the first options behind Jalen Gilbo is Jade Barron. But if we were to put someone else into this conversation, I think it'd be Jelani McDonald. Or do you just want to lead?
Yeah, I agree. I think we put both there again.
Okay. Because if you wanted to keep, that would be if you wanted to keep Jade Barron at outside corner. But that, might vary based on the matchup that week. So who knows? All right. So that's that. I think in terms of what we have at linebacker, I think it's pretty set in stone.
Yeah.
I don't know how comfortable right now we are with our backup plan if Ant Hill was to get hurt, but right now that guy seems to be Leona Lafau.
Yeah.
And then the way it's been the past couple years is Mo Blackwell is going to play that weak side linebacker behind David Binga. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. Those are the main guys. Those are the mainstays. I do want to run something by you though.
Okay.
We are approaching 30 minutes here, and I'm thinking if we wrap up the first first part of the season projections at around 30-minute mark, I think maybe we, instead of doing an end of season projection this episode, maybe we do like a 4-week check-in after the week 4 game around the start of SEC play.
Okay. That sounds good to me.
Yeah, that way we can move on to the team previews.
Okay. All right. So I don't know why I didn't Mo Blackwell in all caps. Okay. So here's where some conversation is going. I'll just fix that later.
Yeah, it's all right.
Here's where some conversation is going to ensue because we're really deep at both of our edge spots. I think right now, because he played both positions last year, but he played mostly on the strong side with Barron Sorrell. I think Ethan Burke's that third edge right now.
I agree.
And I think he's mainly behind Baron Sorrell. But the question becomes then, are we – because I think technically you could make the argument that Ethan Burke is kind of that third guy behind both Trey Moore and Baron Sorrell. But there's also the Colin Simmons factor of this whole equation. And then Justice Finkley is a guy that's been in the program a couple of years. So since we're so deep at these positions, what do you think is the way to go here?
Well, I think we have Ethan Burke set in stone. I think that's correct. With the defensive tackles, though, I don't know if I really see it as a first string, second string type of thing. I think who we have at the first team spots are kind of set in stone. I think those guys are going to get the most snaps out of the defensive tackles. But behind that, everybody else, I think, is going to be on an even amount of snaps, just kind of spread out. The Alex Januaries, the two guys we brought in from Arizona. Do you kind of see it the same way? Who in your mind has emerged within that group?
Against Colorado State, you might be right because it's going to be close to 120, 130 degrees on the field. And, they're going to beat Colorado State. They're hopefully going to beat Colorado State's brains in if they're the kind of team that we think they are. So I do think based on how hot it's going to be and you want fresh legs in there, and they want to get reps for these guys in that game, in preparation for Michigan, which will obviously be a much bigger challenge. I do think you're going to get a lot of snaps for Alex January, and I don't know about Sadir Mitchell. That might be going a little too far. But I do think Alex January, based on what he showed in camp, is going to get snaps. Based on what I'm hearing, Jermaine Lole and Bill Norton would kind of be those frontline guys behind Alfred Collins and Vernon Broughton. You would have Bill Norton play the nose tackle, nose shade, but right behind Vernon Broughton. And then you would have Jermaine Lole kind of play that 3 technique, as he's more suited to do that behind Alfred Collins. And
okay. Then let's go ahead and lock that in then.
Then you could kind of work in Tia Savea and Alex January.
Right. Okay.
That's at least what I would do for the game.
I was really tuned into the defensive tackle room at the start of camp. But since then, my brain has more so focused on the secondary.
And to be fair, we still haven't heard a ton about Bill Norton, Jermaine Lole, and Tia Savea really emerging as guys that are standouts in practice. Now, that could be a whole lot different. In 12 days, we could be talking about how Bill Norton, had 3 tackles for loss and had 2 sacks against, Colorado State, and how he should maybe take Vernon Broughton's job or at least be vying for it. But right now, I think based on experience, I would probably go Bill Norton and Jermaine Lole as your 2 guys behind Alfred Collins and Vernon Broughton. And then beyond that, man, we just have this other edge position. For me, it's probably a Ethan Burke or Colin Simmons discussion, but I don't know. It's tough. What do you think?
Ethan Burke or Colin Simmons? Where do you see Colton Vasek fitting into all this?
That's a good question. I on the two deep right away, I don't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't say he's in too deep either. From what I've heard,
He's the guy
I heard
though.
Rod. Yeah, I've heard Rod Davers talking about this a little bit. Is apparently they're going to move Colin Simmons around quite a bit. Like they'll have him here at this spot as a second, as kind of like a fourth edge, as a weak
Yeah,
side guy, but also he might play a little bit of weak side linebacker as well,
yeah, he's gonna.
along with Mo Blackwell.
That's a fair. He's gonna play kind of the Anthony. I think they wanted to play kind of the Anthony Hill role that Anthony Hill played last year. You know, when he was moving around a lot before he really kind of set in stone at weak side linebacker next to Jalen Ford at the end of last season. But in terms of too deep and how we set it up for the sake of time, I'm just gonna put Colin Simmons here.
Yeah, can't go wrong with that.
But to your point, like I do think when we check in after 4 games, because Texas is they're gonna play Louisiana Monroe, they're gonna play UTSA, they're gonna play Colorado State. Mix all that in with the Michigan game. Colin Vasek, who's a guy who's had his fair share of injuries since he showed up on campus and hasn't really been able to work towards getting good playing time. I think he redshirted last year, if I'm not mistaken. So as a redshirt freshman, now that he's healthy and has shown flashes in camp, he could be a guy that in week 4 we're talking about potentially emerging into the 2D.
Right.
Based on how things are going, if there's an injury that occurs. But for right now, we'll go Colin Simmons. All right, well,
I agree with that.
That pretty much does it, except this other safety position. I think, based on what I've heard, it's probably Jelani McDonald, who can play the nickel or safety. Maybe Xavier Filsaime, the 5-star freshman. I think that's probably a and or situation, but based on seniority and the fact that Jelani's been in the system for a year now, whereas Xavier Filsaime's been on campus for a mere 6-7 months. I think for the first game of the season, early on in the season, they would err on the side of caution and go with Jelani McDonald. But that's my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay. All right. So that's going to be our 2 deep projection segment. I found that segment to be pretty fun. We'll do the same thing for the offense next episode, and then we'll do our 4-week check-ins after the first 4 games. You ready for some team previews?
Yeah, let's do it, man.
Rapid fire team previews. All right, let's do this thing. Let's first start with a team that plays their first game this weekend against Georgia Tech in Dublin. That is the Florida State Seminoles. In a couple minutes, maybe even less than that, go ahead and recap for us what was Florida State's controversial 2023 season.
Well, they did what they had to do. They went undefeated in the regular season. They did what they had to do in theory, of course. They had the unfortunate injury to Jordan Travis. I think it was week 10, late on in the season. And unfortunately for them, with a mixture of their strength of schedule and a mixture of their backup quarterback play looking incompetent. Because I think if their backup quarterback went in there and completed, 10 of 19 passes for 120 yards and a touchdown,
Yeah.
this wouldn't have happened. They would have been in the playoff.
Right.
But because their backup quarterback would barely even able to complete a pass.
Right.
It just became a situation where they were left out. And now they come into this year, obviously Mike Norvell as a super respected coach, now with this rallying cry to back up what is already a very motivated roster here. They obviously did lose a lot of talent, but this is a team that just reloads every year, man. The transfer portal, recruiting, you name it. And this year is no different. They brought in DJU from Oregon State, and word from camp is that he's looked to have improved quite a bit in his time in Oregon State and over the summer here. So this is a team that has playoff expectations. Like, there's no way around it.
Yes, that is absolutely 100% correct. Everything you said was spot on. Look, at the end of last year, and last year was the year of me standing on the table for Florida State. And of course, it kind of all fell apart at the seams once Jordan Travis had that horrific injury to his lower extremity. But Florida State won all their games last year. They won the ACC. They took care of business. They scheduled everyone wants to say, Florida State's schedule was weak last year. And I think that's more so a product of the ACC not necessarily having a strong year last year outside of Florida State. And that's fair. But they did schedule and beat 2 SEC opponents in the regular season. Remember the opening game against LSU? Where Keon Coleman went off and really took control of that game in the second half. Like, we all can look back on that and say, well, LSU's defense was awful. But they had an offense, right, that Florida State had to go up against. They had a potent offense, number one.
And held them to under 20 points.
Yeah, I think it was 24 or something. But
regardless,
they held them to one of their lowest outputs, looking back on it, of the season, and they blew them out. And then, in addition to that, I think they played. Who was the other SEC team that they beat last year?
Was it Florida?
Yes, it was Florida. And, Florida wasn't great either, but that's still a rivalry game. So, yes, they did everything they had to do. They were one of 3 undefeated Power 5 champions, and it was unprecedented just because we never seen a team, a Power 5 conference champion go undefeated, win their conference championship, and be left out of the playoff. But because of the circumstances, the unique circumstances that were there, and obviously the ugly bowl game, they ended up getting left out. So Mike Norvell returns for his 5th year, and he's one of the better coaches in college football, knows how to recruit, knows how to go out and identify the talent that fits their program in the transfer portal. He basically built a lot of that team last year was built off the transfer portal. Key guys at key positions, Keon Coleman, Jared Verse, to name a few, right? And he's done it again this year in some respects. I think the ACC, just in general, the top of the ACC is not getting enough attention for how competitive it could be this year. I think Miami, who we already discussed, is going to be a really formidable team, a playoff contender, if Cam Ward and some of those portal additions pan out the way that I think they can. I think Florida State, looking at their schedule, once again, can be that kind of team. And then Clemson, is never to be slept on. If Cade Klubnik in that offense can take another step and they have the playmakers on the outside, and they have a much better offensive year than they did in the past couple years, they could emerge as a dangerous team because of what they have on defense.
Right. The other thing about the ACC too is they have a lot of plucky teams in the middle pack too that can really upset all of those teams. Virginia Tech, NC State, Louisville.
Right. Yep, those are the pack of teams that we're not going to talk about individually, but once we get into the season, absolutely will be a factor of the equation. So, in terms of Florida State, the main things you need to know are, this was a top 20 offense a year ago. They were 19th in scoring offense. They were 12th in points per play. They were 46 in passing offense, 40th in quarterback rating. Jordan Travis had a really good year, 5th in touchdown to interception ratio. They were a good offense, right? They averaged almost 35 points per game. Not an elite offense, but a really good offense. Jordan Travis departs after 4 seasons as the starter. And his best season was his last season. So who comes in at quarterback? Well, they go out and they get DJ Uiagalelei, who comes from Oregon State, previously at Clemson. He improved at Oregon State last year after a couple rough years at Clemson to start his career, but he's a former 5-star recruit with a huge arm, just an absolute howitzer for an arm. He's a big guy, 6'5", 245, 250 pounds. He's kind of a bowling ball in the run game when he gets going downhill. He's not going to be nearly as shifty or elusive or creative as Jordan Travis, but he can definitely extend the defense vertically and can help in short yardage as kind of like a goal line QB sneak guy. But the one thing that's always been the concern with him is his accuracy. Pretty much at almost everywhere on the field. And so how much is that going to improve could have a lot of, impact on how far this Florida State team can go. If he's the same guy he was at Florida State, though, I'll ask you this question. At Oregon State. What is Florida State's ceiling, in your opinion? Because I think a lot rests on the shoulders of DJU for this offense to succeed.
Well, I think if he's the same guy he was at Oregon State, I think that's more than enough for this team to be able to compete at a very high level. I think he was very solid last year. Obviously, Oregon State had a very potent running game that they had to offer as well. And I think DJU will bring that to the table also. I think they'll be able to move the ball regardless of whether he's an elite passer, but I think whether or not they're national championship threats or even, I guess, a second round threat, you could say, that would depend on whether he can be efficient in the passing game. But I think that's something that they'll tackle when they tackle it. And I have a lot of confidence in his ability to improve because the development track he's taken has been a steady climb. Like even in those rough years at Clemson, he improved from the first year to the second year. So it's clear that he's putting in the work.
Yeah, he's always been a guy I've rooted for, but I think if he's kind of around the same guy that he's been the past couple of years, last year Oregon State completing 57% of his passes with 21 touchdowns and 7 picks. That's good enough to get you through this ACC schedule to the ACC championship game, maybe at 11-1, 10-2 kind of record, and maybe even get you in the playoff. But I don't think the same guy he's been over the past couple of years is contending for, say, a national championship. I think Florida State could be, if they win their conference, they'll get a bye, and maybe then having to play in that environment, getting that home field advantage, getting a bye, they can make a run towards the national championship. But if he's kind of this same guy that he's been, I don't see them contending for a national championship. Now, having said that, I like a lot of what they brought in offensively. On defense, though, is where there are some questions. They were a really stout defense a year ago. I mean, if you take out the bowl game, just leave that out against Georgia, which was an ugly one.
Yeah, everybody sat out.
They were a top 5. They were top 5 in most of the opponent adjusted defensive metrics. If you take out that game, they were right up there with Ohio State, Penn State, Iowa, and Georgia's some of the best defenses in college football. But 7 of their 12 starters are gone on the defensive side of the ball. 5 guys return, and they are impact players. But on the defensive line, you're losing Jared Verse, who was kind of the vocal leader, along with Braden Fisk on the interior. You lose 2 linebackers, 2 longtime starters, in Kalen DeLoach and Tatum Bethune. And then in the secondary, you're losing Renardo Green, Jerry Jones, and Akeem Dent. So you're losing a lot of experience and talent influx from this defense a year ago, which made it one of the best defenses in the country. But they have Fentrell Cypress, who was a top transfer they got in last year's transfer class, who's set in stone at one of their corner spots. They have a really good nickel specialist, Azari Thomas, I think is how you say his name, who's going to headline their secondary back there. They have a couple good safeties. They recruit the defensive side of the ball extremely well. Josh Farmer is going to return on the defensive line. Daryl Jackson, who was a rotational player last year, is going to come back. They have DJ Lundy at the linebacker position, who was an ACC honorable mention guy last year. They have 3 top 200 kind of recruits behind him in that linebacker room. I still think this defense can be very good. I don't know if it can be as good as it was a year ago, but Florida State has proven under Mike Norvell, to pump out really good defenses. So I think overall this team has the personnel to win the ACC, provided a lot of their key players stay healthy. For me, it's more of a race between them in Miami than it is them in Clemson, although I know that Florida State-Clemson game is one of the biggest games every year, and still will continue to be. I just right now, if you're asking me who I think is going to win the ACC, I don't know that I view Florida State as kind of the favorite right now, because I kind of view Miami as that team.
Yeah, and with the conversation of TJU, whether he improves, to me, it's the difference between them being a favorite in an ACC championship game against Miami or being the underdog. To me, that's the difference. And I think I would probably agree with you. I have more confidence in Cam Ward as a passer. I have more confidence in Mike Norvell as a coach over Mario Cristobal at this moment. So that, to me, even things out. But regardless of what happens in their first matchup, I think if they were to meet in the ACC championship game, it's all going to depend on the form of DJU. And because I think Florida State's program is more established, and even with all the roster turnover, is more experienced in these big games.
Yeah, I would agree. Okay, to the Big Ten we go. These are teams, lots of our audience and everyone around college football are either waiting to hear people talk about or are talking about every single day.
Yep.
Let's start with Ohio State, and then we'll talk about Oregon. We haven't really talked a whole lot about Ohio State since portal season.
Nuggets.
Yeah. They did a lot, and they have a lot coming back. There's a reason lots of these media outlets, as they start to unleash their predictions, as we're now basically going full force into the regular season, have Ohio State winning the national championship. They have a new quarterback. They have a ton of starters coming back on defense. They're just loaded at every and all positions. But the storyline around Michigan State is, from 2005 to 2020, the COVID year, Ohio State went 15-1. against their arch rival, the Michigan Wolverines. They were dominating Michigan. They had Michigan figured out. But ever since then, as we know, the tables have kind of turned a little bit. Michigan made it 3 in a row. And this time, they did it with a clock draining 7-minute drive and an interception to seal it. So they've kind of physically imposed their will on Ohio State in the last couple of matchups in the running game. Obviously, we know Michigan's team is going to look a whole lot different this upcoming season. Some of the main pieces of the national championship team went to the NFL. I mean, I think it was 16 of them. What was the number for Michigan players getting drafted? I think it was around there. So the number one story, in my opinion, around Ohio State is, are they going to beat Michigan? And if they don't, what happens to Ryan Day, or what does that conversation look like? What is your kind of vibe on what happened last year with Ohio State? The stretch that Ryan Day, the record that he has against Michigan now being 1-3, and kind of how you view Ryan Day going into this year.
Well, I think for one, you got to get the quarterback position right. Obviously, C.J. Stroud, what we know now, like maybe okay, like looking back on it, maybe you should have taken advantage a little bit more of C.J. Stroud in terms of beating Michigan. But regardless, he ended up playing. They ended up making the playoff regardless, and took Georgia, the eventual national champion, to the brink. So they've been in the conversation year over year over year for the national championship, regardless of whether or not they've beaten Michigan. And it's not like they're getting blown off the field by Michigan either. I mean, losing by one possession at home to the eventual national champion, if you put it that way, then it's a lot easier to contemplate. But because it's Michigan, the sky is falling. I think a lot of unnecessary, discourse has taken place with Ryan Day, in my opinion. I think he's a very good coach, and I think he's shown a willingness to evolve this offseason that I like, and I'm rooting for him to succeed this year because he went out and got a Chip Kelly to help him run things so that he can focus on the entire team as a whole, not just the offense as much. He went out and added to the coaching staff and looked to add a bit more physicality to their team. Little things like that, I think, show that you're not just stuck in your ways as a coach. And to me, that's the sign of a good coach. So whether he wins this year or not, whether he gets, booted after this year or not, I think how we view success is just is a little bit tainted when it comes to this.
Right. So here's kind of where Ohio State stands as a roster. And then we probably got to jump to Oregon so we can wrap this up in less than an hour 20.
Right.
So based on, and this is no shot at Kyle McCord, who's still a young quarterback, because he still did place actually in the top 15 nationally in quarterback rating last year. But after what was such a fantastic run of elite, NFL first round caliber quarterback play for Ohio State under Ryan Day, last year felt like a major step back from what they have had in the past. There were long patches of inconsistent play from Kyle McCord. 24 touchdowns thrown were the fewest by a starting quarterback since Ryan Day was hired in Columbus. So he transferred out. He went to Syracuse. I think he's going to start for Syracuse. I hope he does good things there. But this year, they go out and get a winner, a Big 12 champion, an experienced quarterback in Will Howard, to go along with their deep quarterback room. They've got a 5-star coming in this year in the 2024 cycle, a guy who they got from Alabama after Nick Saban retired, and Julian Sayin, who's a young guy who's going to be in this quarterback room. They have Devin Brown, who was in a quarterback competition last year with Kyle McCord, ended up losing it. I expect him to probably be the primary backup to Will Howard. They have a lot of talent in this quarterback room. But Will Howard, he's a good player. He's a winner. He's experienced. He's not going to be, I don't think, like frightened by these big environments, right? I mean, the weather up there is going to obviously be different. The weather conditions are going to be different than down south in the environments that he was playing in the Big 12. But that's probably really the only thing you question about Will Howard is how will he handle those different environments. But with the talent around him, as long as people stay healthy, and his experience in college football, the player that he is, second team All Big 12 a year ago, ahead of Quinn Ewers, ahead of a lot of talent in that conference, 48, career touchdown passes. I think he's going to do really good things. I think he's already been named the starter. What's your take on Will Howard for this year?
Well, you mentioned the experience. You mentioned the fact that he's won big games before. To me, it's just going to be all about you're driving a Ferrari. You're driving a Lamborghini here. Just don't crash. That's really all you got to do. And obviously, there's going to be moments where maybe the tire pops. You got to repair it, and then you got to keep moving. Like, I think for him, it's just going to be all about who are you in the fourth quarter when it's 3rd and 13 against an elite pass rush in Eugene, Oregon, or something like that. Like, we know who he is down to down in terms of consistency. It's can he deliver in those big moments? And that's really a question with any quarterback. But to me, that's what I question.
Yeah, I think I had the same questions. But when you talk about what he has around him, I think the hire of Chip Kelly, more so than anything, is going to really boost Ohio State's running game. Not that Ohio State's running game has been bad in the past couple of years, but I don't think, based on the talent that they've had up front and the athletes that they have in the backfield, I don't think it's been, as imposing as it could be at times in years past. And when you look at Chip Kelly's UCLA teams, what do? They ran the damn football, and they ran it effectively. They were physical. I think that's the first thing he's going to do. I think more so than anything, he comes in as offensive coordinator. He's going to help with the offense. Obviously, I kind of view this as kind of like a tag team. Ryan Day, very adept in calling, scheming up passing. I think Chip Kelly will really help this running game. I think based on their personnel, they shouldn't really have any problem doing so. They return 3 offensive linemen, including both their tackles, who got good playing time last year. And they added a 2-year starting center from Alabama in Seth McLaughlin, who will fit right in on the interior of that offensive line and help the running game as he did at Alabama. They have a shit ton of talent at running back and a shit ton of talent, as they always do, at wide receiver. with Julian Fleming transferring to a rival, by the way, in Penn State, they still have Emeka Egbuka, who was a 1,000-yard receiver back in 2022 and is now kind of being relied upon to be the number one target. And then behind him, just 4 5-stars. We just have 4 5-stars behind him that we'll throw out, including the number one overall rated receiver in this past year's recruiting class, Jeremiah Smith, who's probably going to start game one for them. Then you have Quinshon Judkins, who you go out and get from Ole Miss, along with Travion Henderson, who's coming back from an injury. This offense should be one of the elite offenses in the country. And that's to go along with a defense that was one of the best defenses in the country a year ago. And they get 8 starters returning, plus an All-American safety in Caleb Downs for some additional star power. I mean, Are you kidding me? It's really unreal what the kind of offseason that they had. Any final words that you want to mention on Ohio State?
Well, I think people need to realize that this is not a team that is overwhelmingly built on transfer portal and new additions. Obviously, there is quite a bit of them and high-profile ones. But there's also the bedrock, the core of the team that is just all just returning starters. Outside of maybe the wide receiver core that got a little bit, poached a little bit by the NFL. Outside of that, you look at just about every position group on this team, and you look at production standpoint. You go, that guy's returning, that guy's returning, that guy's returning. And you realize just how deep and how good this team really is.
Yeah. Ohio State, look, they retained almost all their players from last year. They added another top 5 recruiting class. They layered on 5 of the best transfers in America. I think this year is the year that they're going to fix their Michigan issue, whatever that is. I think they get that game at home. I think they'll win that game this year. I expect them to. It's hard to say who they're going to play in the Big Ten championship game. Maybe it's the team that we talk about here in a second in Oregon. Most people are projecting that. I wouldn't be surprised if, they go to Oregon October 12th on the road, they lose that game, but then they get them back, in the Big Ten championship game. Something like that happens. But they're going to have a really good year, and I expect them to return to the playoff, and this year is the year where they need to contend for a national championship. All right. Let's go ahead and talk about Oregon. Just in the next 3-4 minutes, give me your overall, paint the picture for me, last year and this year, what you think about the Oregon Ducks.
Well, Dan Lanning is clearly building something really positive, something that a lot of the media got behind, including Josh Pate, Joel Klatt, guys that we listen to a lot, picking them to beat Washington twice in some cases. I think both of us did too. We really bought into what Dan Lanning was selling here.
Yep.
And, how could you not? The receivers that they had, the physicality on defense. For whatever reason, though, they just couldn't get it done in those 2 Washington games, and that was their downfall. They just needed to win one, and that would have done it. Particularly the second one. That one really hurt. The fact that they really got torn up on the ground the way they did. And they come back this season. They addressed some of those things that Washington kind of exposed them with, which is defensive physicality. And Dan Lanning's culture is still getting implemented here. So it's another year on top of what is already building towards something really, really special here. So I feel really good about where this Oregon team is at, and losing Bo Nix and bringing in Dylan Gabriel, I think it is a downgrade in terms of playing in the Big Ten, not having a guy with as big of an arm, but Dylan Gabriel still is one of the best quarterbacks in college football last year. So not a huge drop off.
Yeah, it was really 6 points that made the difference for Oregon last year. Is a 3-point loss to Washington in October and a 3-point loss to Washington in December that really made the difference in Oregon being in the playoff and not being in the playoff. They competed in both those games. They came up a field goal short twice, though, against a bitter rival. And, losing to the national runner-up 2 times isn't a bad thing most years for most programs. But Oregon, with what Dan Lanning has done, having Oregon's talent acquisition at an all-time high and having unlocked a higher tier of recruiting than what was initially imagined for the Oregon program, given where they are located in the country, kind of secluded in the Pacific Northwest, which is a disadvantage for them in recruiting. Dan Lanning, give him credit because of his familiarity with SEC country and, because of NIL, which Oregon has a ton of. They're doing some
and then moving to the Big Ten.
Yep. And moving conferences definitely has something to do with it. They're starting to really up their level of talent acquisition, both from the high school ranks and in the portal. And, for a program like Oregon, the goal for them is to close the gap. They really don't have that much further to go. They've done a really good job over the past couple of years in closing the gap in terms of elite of the elite talent, meaning super blue chip level prospects from the portal and at the high school ranks. Those high 4-star, 5-star guys, the elite of the elite. And they're not there yet. Like, they're not yet to the level of Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State in terms of the number of elite football players on their roster, but they're the next thing closest to it, and they're getting closer. And if they continue to recruit like this over the next 1 or 2 years, they'll be right there with those programs when it's all said and done. So,
yeah,
top 10 transfer classes, back-to-back years. A high school class last year, which shattered their previous records. I think it was near top 5 nationally or somewhere around there. They're definitely, I think, out of all the Pac-12 schools heading to the Big Ten, they're clearly the best position of them all to have success right away. And there's a reason why they're projected to finish, second in the conference, much like Texas is in the SEC in their first years in the conference. But in terms of the roster, before we wrap up here, you mentioned Dylan Gabriel. What they were able to do at quarterback in the portal is really impressive. I don't think they get enough credit for not only getting Dylan Gabriel, but also getting 5-star Dante Moore, who was a 5-star in the 2023 recruiting class and started games at UCLA. He's going to sit behind Dylan Gabriel this year, but you have your quarterback for now, this year, and trying to win a national championship this year, and then you have a quarterback for next year, a guy who'll be ready to step in right away, or at least we think. I like that. Okay, Dylan Gabriel last year, over 3,500 yards, 30 touchdowns, only 6 picks, and a 70% completion rate. He was a quasi Heisman contender at Oklahoma last year. 1 year of eligibility, so you have to make the most of it this year, or at least you want to try to. How do they do that? Well, look, Their top rusher, Bucky Irving, he departs. Troy Franklin's in the NFL now, right? That's so you obviously lose lots from your team last year. But you pass the torch to Jordan James, who I think is going to emerge as a well-rounded, complete back. And then even though you lose Troy Franklin, like you return Tez Johnson, and you bring in a former 5-star in Evan Stewart from Texas A&M, a guy who I wanted Texas to get badly before, like he was my number one choice, even over Jonte Cook. By the slimmest of margins in that 2023 recruiting class, but he ends up going to A&M. Jonte Cook comes to Texas, and now things didn't pan out as well as I think they probably should have at A&M for a variety of reasons for Evan Stewart. Now he's at Oregon, and I think that's going to really work for them. I expect their offense to be good. Defensively, they killed it in the portal. They went out and got Jamari Caldwell from Houston, who was an all-league defensive tackle last year in the Big 12. They go out and they steal Jabbar Muhammad from Washington to fill that boundary corner spot. He was first-team All-Pac-12 last year. He kind of fills in behind Kyrie Jackson, the hole left by Kyrie Jackson. They have a really nice transfer from UTSA, Cam Alexander, who's going to start in the secondary, Jaleel Florence. They're pretty deep at corner. They're replacing 2 starters at safety. We'll see how that goes, but I think this defense, with what they've added in the portal, they're going to have impact playmakers, and I think they're going to be plenty good in terms of the physicality up front to win a lot of football games and position themselves to be in the Big Ten championship game and go far beyond that. So I think after what happened in the Alabama coaching search, where we heard, that Dan Lanning was possibly a candidate for that job, I think after Dan Lanning released that video confirming that he was staying at Oregon, kind of saying we have a program that can be the best in the country, I think that speaks a lot for the culture that they have at Oregon. Now like Dan Lanning is going to, if you're being recruited, whether through the portal or in high school, Dan Lanning is going to be here no matter what. He's trying to build something special at Oregon. And that's going to help them in terms of their talent acquisition. So I think if Oregon is healthy, they're pretty much like a top 5, top 6 team lock for me, and a lock for a playoff spot. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. I think the last thing that I would say on Oregon is just the game against Ohio State. The game. Do they play Michigan this year?
Yes.
They do play Penn State, I think.
No Penn State. They do play at Michigan.
Right. Okay. So Ohio State and Michigan.
Yeah.
Do you win one of those 2 games, or both, or neither? I think that's where the narrative is going to start to be built on Dan Lanning. If they end up losing both of those games, it's going to be, when will Dan Lanning win the big one, or will he win the big one? And if they end up winning both of those, all of those questions will go away like that, because he does everything else as a coach. He motivates his team. He recruits at the highest level. He gets guys in the transfer portal. So all he has to do now is win.
Yeah, I would agree. And they're in a very similar spot to Ohio State, given, Oregon even more so. Like, Ohio State returns 7 starters on offense, 9 on defense. Oregon returns 8 starters on offense and 9 on defense. and both did a fantastic job in the portal. So they both have the luxury of getting a lot of their team back from good teams last year, adding to it through the portal, having impact freshmen that are coming in ready to contribute right away in different roles. These are the two teams at the top of the Big Ten that are going to get the majority of the attention. But there are, as we talked about, we discussed Penn State, the year that they could have. We've discussed Michigan, kind of the wild card that they are this year. And then, if Iowa has a lick of offensive competency, they could, based on what they are defensively, they could be 10-2 based on their schedule.
Same with Nebraska.
Yeah. And they've already been going 10-2, with horrible offenses. So it's not to say that I'm predicting Iowa's going to be in the playoff or Nebraska's going to be competing for the Big Ten or even USC can make a run at that. It's just like when you look at the top of the Big Ten and then you look at the middle class, there could be a team in the middle class that emerges as a bubble playoff team, like in Iowa or, I don't know about Nebraska, but, one of these teams could emerge as kind of that team. I think Iowa would probably be the most popular pick, maybe USC if they get to 10-2. But we'll have to see how it all plays out. That's why we play the games, ladies and gentlemen. Right. Any closing remarks or parting shots before we get out of here tonight?
I think that episode went really well, man. In terms of closing remarks, I just think, I don't know. It's been a long time coming, waiting to talk about these three teams in particular. Ohio State was one that I had on my radar for a while, obviously. As we said at the start of the show, like these are the three teams that just live in media conversations when it comes to college football. So there was obviously a lot to say, and we did it in an hour 20 minutes, which is a little over what we normally do, but I think it's well worth it.
Yeah, it's gonna be kind of the nature of the beast for the next week and a half as we get into the swing of game weeks. But I think once we get into our recap episodes, we have so much to talk about, so much that is on our minds going into the season as Texas fans. But outside of that, trying to cover the broad scope of college football, mainly the SEC and Big Ten, with the new 12-team playoff and everything else that's thrown into play here, that these preview episodes are probably going to end up being a little bit longer and drawn out than the in-season episodes will be. I anticipate the in-season episodes being more so in our target range, 45-minute to an hour kind of shows.
Right.
But
obviously, this is a Texas show, so
yeah,
it's going to be like we're going to cover the full scope of college football as much as possible, but it's going to be in the frame of how it affects Texas and teams that Texas is competing with in terms of the playoff.
Right. And I was, one of the exciting parts of moving to the SEC, and this will kind of be my parting shot. And I've heard this brought up on a couple of different other outlets, from a couple outlets that I listen to, is watching an A&M game is going to have different meaning for a Texas fan. Because you're on that collision course for the end of the season, that huge game at the end of the year. Watching Michigan's game in week 1 is going to have a whole lot more meaning for Texas than it did in the big. Watching any Michigan game, watching any Georgia game early on in the season has a whole different meaning for Texas fans than it did when they were in the Big 12 and there was no real collision course for Texas and Georgia to play. That's one of the exciting parts of moving to the SEC, because I don't know, I can't speak for you, but I think I can speak for a lot of Texas fans, maybe you included, that weren't watching TCU really closely the week before
Yeah.
Texas would
Yeah.
play them to try to see what that potentially is going to look like. Or
Yeah,
we're
and
watching.
honestly, yeah, on that note too is like that could even be a segment, just like Texas opponent scouting.
Yeah. I think that's we'll talk. We'll try to drill down into that idea more,
Yeah.
but that'll be something that in some form or fashion will be a part of our Thursday episodes. Okay. 10 days from kickoff. We're getting there, folks. Technically, when we do our Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports episode on Sunday, it's game week. Because I consider Sunday the start of the week. So, yeah, there's that. And then we'll have an NFL episode for you guys tomorrow night. That's going to be, I believe it's next up, the Lions and Texans. I think is what it is. I have to double check that, but because I believe we have. Well, I won't reveal the rankings, but I think it's Lions and Texans. That's what we'll be doing tomorrow. And then I haven't quite decided on my recruiting show. Obviously, we missed out on it last week, but there wasn't a whole lot of action on the recruiting front. This week, the recruiting show is going to be pretty jam-packed. That's all I can really say right now. We've got, the Michael Fasusi decision. We've got Jonah Williams is committing on Saturday. We've got Nick Brooks, who's an offensive lineman. He's committing on Friday. Jamie French is committing next week. It's commitment season in the world of recruiting. We've got Dia Bell, Texas's quarterback commitment in the class of 2026, playing live on ESPN on Friday night. There's a lot there. So, yeah, we'll be talking about all that. I don't know when that will be yet. Probably be Friday night, maybe. I don't know yet. We'll see. But until then, until tomorrow night, and until Sunday night, this has been Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports, 10 days away from kickoff of the 2024 Texas Longhorns football season. We cannot be more excited. Please, if you are watching live, like and subscribe. It helps our algorithm. It helps recommend our videos to, people on YouTube. And tell your friends about us. If you have friends that like sports or like the Longhorns, tell your friends to check us out. We greatly appreciate it. For Emmy Nixon and for Michael Ween, we'll see you on Sunday night for another edition of Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports. But until then, keep your horns up, hook 'em, and peace out.